The most powerful Italian crime family in New York sent a messenger to Harlem with a simple ultimatum: accept our terms or face the consequences. Bumpy Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a gun. He just listened. And when the messenger finished talking, Johnson's response wasn't a threat. It was, in a quiet way, the end of the mob's entire strategy. This is the story behind the day Bumpy Johnson challenged the influence of New York's Italian crime families, and what he did instead of fighting is the part most people get wrong. This video explores historical events for educational and documentary purposes. Some details are based on historical records and oral accounts, which may differ across sources. To understand what happened that day, you have to set aside the version of this story that gets repeated in movies and in half-true legends passed around for decades. Harlem, in the early 1940s, wasn't just a neighborhood to the men who ran organized crime in New York. It was a market they had been trying to break into for years, and by most accounts, they never fully understood it. They assumed a black neighborhood running its own numbers game had to be disorganized, undisciplined, easy to absorb once they decided it was worth the trouble. That assumption turned out to be wrong, and the man who proved it wrong was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to almost everyone simply as Bumpy. By 1943, Johnson wasn't just a man with guns and loyal soldiers. He was running something closer to a business, with roots, collectors, bookkeepers, and a customer base that trusted him more than they trusted the police or city hall. The numbers racket, sometimes called policy, was the beating financial heart of Harlem. People placed small bets, a nickel here, a quarter there, hoping to hit a combination of digits from a public number, like a horse racing total or a stock exchange figure. The odds were long, most people lost, but the ones who won sometimes won enough to pay rent for months, and that hope, repeated daily across a neighborhood of hundreds of thousands of people, added up to serious money. Historians who have studied the numbers business in Harlem estimate that it generated tens of millions of dollars a year across the neighborhood, even though almost none of the individual bets were large. The Italian families downtown had noticed this for a long time. Prohibition had made men like Lucky Luciano and his allies extraordinarily rich, and when Prohibition ended, they went looking for other revenue streams. Gambling was the obvious one. It didn't carry the same federal weight that liquor once had, and it was, in a strange way, more reliable, because people always wanted to gamble, recession or not, war or not. The problem was that Harlem's numbers business wasn't run by amateurs waiting to be pushed aside. It was run by people who had learned, the hard way, how to survive in a city that wasn't built to let them succeed. Johnson was chief among them, and by the early 1940s, according to most accounts of the era, he had become the person other operators in Harlem looked to for protection, guidance, and when necessary, muscle. So when the Italian families decided it was time to formally bring Harlem's numbers business under their control, they didn't expect an argument. They expected, at most, negotiation over percentages. What they got instead was something closer to a philosophy. The messenger who came to deliver the ultimatum wasn't some low-level soldier picked at random. He was sent because he could speak with some authority, because whoever chose him understood that showing up with a nobody would be its own kind of insult. According to accounts passed down through people who were close to the situation, the message was polite on its surface. Partnership was offered, protection was offered. What was really being offered, underneath the diplomatic language, was ownership. Harlem's numbers business would still run day to day, but a large share of the profit would now flow downtown, and any decision of real weight would need approval from men who had never set foot above 96th Street, unless they were passing through in a car with the windows up. Johnson listened to the entire message without interrupting. That detail matters more than it might seem. Interrupting would have signaled that he was rattled, that he needed to argue his way out of a position of weakness. Staying silent and letting the messenger finish signaled the opposite. It said, "I am not afraid of anything you are about to say, and I don't need to rush to defend myself." When the messenger was done speaking, there was a pause. Then Johnson responded not with a threat or an insult, but with an argument about numbers. He is said to have explained, calmly, that violence would cost more than it would ever earn back. He pointed out that Harlem trusted him precisely because he wasn't an outside operator squeezing money out of a community he didn't belong to. He explained that if the Italian families tried to take over by force, they would spend years fighting a population that would never fully cooperate, that would hide money, warn runners, protect operators, and quietly sabotage any outside takeover at every turn. The cost of forcing compliance, in his telling, would eat up any profit gained from taking a bigger cut. In other words, respecting Harlem's existing structure and letting Johnson retain control, while paying some form of tribute or forming an alliance, was simply the more profitable choice. Not the safer choice morally, not the fairer choice, just the one that made more financial sense over time. This is the part of the story that tends to get lost when people retell it as a straightforward gangster showdown. There was no dramatic standoff with weapons drawn. There wasn't a demonstration meant to prove Johnson had more guns or braver men. What Johnson offered instead was closer to a business case, delivered by a man who understood that the people he was speaking to respected exactly one language above all others, and that language was profit and loss. It's worth pausing here to talk about who Bumpy Johnson actually was before this moment, because the calm confidence in that room didn't come from nowhere. He was born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, at a time and in a place where, for a black child growing up, it meant learning early that the rules of the world were not built in your favor. His family sent him north to live with an older sister in New York while he was still young, partly to get him away from the dangers of the Jim Crow South, and partly because there were simply more opportunities for a young man in Harlem than in a small southern town where opportunities for black families were deliberately limited. Harlem in the 1920s and into the 1930s was going through what people now call a renaissance, a flowering of black culture, music, writing, and art that made the neighborhood one of the most vibrant places in the entire country. But alongside that creative energy was serious poverty, discrimination in almost every visible institution, and very few paths toward financial stability that didn't run through some form of hustle. Johnson found his way into the numbers business as a young man, working his way up from small jobs to positions of real responsibility. Along the way, he developed a reputation for being sharp, careful, and for not losing his composure even under pressure. He also developed a reputation for reading, oddly enough. Several accounts from people who knew him describe him carrying books, sometimes poetry, sometimes history, and using downtime to keep learning in a way that wasn't common among men in his line of work. This detail isn't meant to romanticize him. He built his career on an illegal business that thrived on the hopes of poor people who could not really afford to lose the money they bet. But understanding that he approached his work analytically, almost like a student of economics and human behavior, helps explain why his response to a mafia ultimatum sounded less like a gangster movie line and more like a boardroom argument. By the early 1940s, Stephanie St. Clair, sometimes called Madame St. Clair or Queenie, had already spent over a decade running one of the most successful numbers operations in Harlem, and Johnson had worked closely with her, eventually becoming her most trusted enforcer and partner as her own influence in day-to-day operations declined. St. Clair had fought her own battles against outside interference years earlier, most notably against Dutch Schultz, an Italian-American gangster whose real name was Arthur Fliegenheimer, when he tried to muscle into Harlem's numbers racket in the early 1930s. St. Clair's resistance to Schultz and her eventual survival of that conflict even after Schultz was killed in 1935 had already established a precedent that Harlem's numbers operators were not simply going to hand over their business because someone downtown decided they wanted it. Johnson had watched all of this happen, had learned from it, and by 1943 he was the person carrying that precedent forward. So when the ultimatum came in 1943, Johnson wasn't improvising some clever response on the spot. He was drawing on years of watching what worked and what didn't in Harlem's long, uneasy relationship with organized crime downtown. He understood that outright refusal without any reasoning behind it would look like stubbornness, and stubbornness alone doesn't survive a conversation with men who control more guns and more money. But a refusal backed by a clear explanation of why cooperation on his terms served everyone's financial interests better than a takeover was something the mob's own logic couldn't easily dismiss. There's a reason this kind of response worked, and it has to do with how the Italian-American crime families in New York actually operated during this period, which was very different from the chaotic, trigger-happy image often shown in films. By the early 1940s, the American Mafia, or La Cosa Nostra, as it later came to be known publicly, had undergone an internal reorganization following years of bloody infighting, loosely known as the Castellamarese War, in the early 1930s. Out of that conflict emerged a structure built around 5 families in New York, each with defined territory and leadership, along with a loose national commission to settle disputes between families without resorting to open warfare whenever disagreements arose. Lucky Luciano is usually credited as the architect of this more business-like structure, and even after his imprisonment and deportation, the system he helped build continued to shape decision-making. This mattered because it meant that by 1943, the men making decisions about Harlem weren't hot-headed street soldiers looking for a fight. They were, in their own way, executives managing a portfolio of illegal enterprises, weighing risk against reward the same way any business leader would, just without the legal system to fall back on if something went wrong. Frank Costello, who held enormous influence over the Luciano family's operations while Luciano was in exile, was known for preferring negotiation, bribery, and quiet influence to open violence whenever possible. He had earned a reputation, even among law enforcement, as someone who solved problems through political connections and financial arrangements rather than through headline-grabbing bloodshed. A man like that was, in a strange way, exactly the right audience for Johnson's argument. Costello wasn't going to order violence purely out of wounded pride if a calmer, cheaper alternative existed and made sense on paper. It's important to be honest here about something. Nobody alive today can quote, word for word, exactly what was said in that room, and different accounts of this period vary in their details, sometimes significantly. Some of what has been passed down likely grew a little in the retelling over the decades, the way any oral history does, especially stories about a man as guarded and private as Johnson was. What historians and researchers who have studied Harlem's underworld during this period generally agree on is the broader shape of events, that there was real pressure from the Italian families to bring Harlem's numbers racket under closer downtown control, that Johnson resisted that pressure without provoking an all-out war, and that the outcome left Johnson with more independence and more standing than almost anyone expected going in. The exact wording of any single conversation is less important than understanding the strategy underneath it, and that strategy was consistent with everything else we know about how Johnson operated throughout his life. What makes this moment worth remembering isn't just that Johnson avoided a war. Plenty of people avoid violence out of simple fear, and there's nothing remarkable about that. What made this different is that Johnson reframed the entire negotiation. He didn't ask the Italian families to leave Harlem alone out of respect or fairness, because appealing to fairness would have meant nothing to men who had built empires on the opposite principle. Instead, he spoke directly to their actual incentive, which was profit, and he made the case that profit was better served by leaving the existing structure in place. This is a subtle but important difference, and it explains why the outcome held rather than becoming just a temporary pause before more pressure came later. In the months that followed, according to most accounts of the period, an uneasy working relationship developed between Johnson's operation and the broader Italian criminal networks downtown. It wasn't a full partnership in the sense of equal ownership, and it wasn't full independence either. Johnson continued running the numbers business in Harlem largely on his own terms, while some understanding existed that allowed for a degree of cooperation, likely involving some financial arrangement, though the exact details of any such arrangement are difficult to verify with full certainty this many decades later. What matters is that Harlem's numbers business did not simply get absorbed and erased as easily as it could have, and Johnson's standing in the neighborhood, already strong, grew even stronger because of how the situation was handled. To really appreciate why this mattered so much to the people of Harlem at the time, you have to understand what else was happening in New York City and across the country in 1943. The nation was deep into the Second World War. Harlem had sent thousands of its young men overseas to fight, and the neighborhood itself was dealing with overcrowding, discrimination in housing, unequal access to jobs even in wartime industries that badly needed workers, and constant friction with a police department that many residents viewed, with good reason, as an occupying force rather than a source of protection. Just months after the events described here, in August of 1943, Harlem experienced a significant riot following the shooting of a black soldier by a white police officer, an event that reflected just how much tension had built up in the neighborhood over years of unequal treatment. Against that backdrop, the idea that outside Italian gangsters might simply walk in and take over one of the few genuinely profitable enterprises that black residents themselves controlled carried a weight that went far beyond dollars and cents. It touched on questions of dignity, self-determination, and whether Harlem would be allowed to run its own affairs at all, even its illegal ones. This is part of why Johnson's calm handling of the situation became something of a neighborhood legend, recounted in barbershops and social clubs for years afterward, even if the retellings sometimes blurred details or added dramatic flourishes that may not have been entirely accurate. People wanted a story in which someone stood up to an outside power without losing everything in the process. And Johnson, whatever his flaws and whatever the true complexity of his relationship with organized crime, became that figure in the neighborhood's collective memory. It would be dishonest, though, to present Johnson as some kind of pure folk hero standing only for community independence. He remained deeply involved in organized crime throughout much of his adult life, running an illegal gambling enterprise that profited from the hopes of people who often could not afford to lose money on long-shot bets. He served time in prison more than once over the course of his life, including a lengthy stretch at Alcatraz during the 1950s after a narcotics conviction, a period that seems to have changed him in some ways, according to people who knew him both before and after his incarceration. Some accounts describe him as becoming more withdrawn, more prone to citing scripture, and generally more reflective after his time at Alcatraz, though how much of that shift was genuine change and how much was simply age catching up with him is impossible to say with certainty. What complicates the picture even further is his relationship, later in life, with figures entirely removed from the numbers racket. Johnson is often mentioned in connection with Malcolm X, since both men spent time in Harlem during overlapping years and moved in overlapping social circles, though the depth and nature of any real friendship between them is something historians describe with appropriate caution, since much of what is claimed comes from second-hand accounts rather than a clear, documented record. It's safer to say that Johnson was a recognized fixture of Harlem's social and political landscape by the 1950s and 1960s, someone whose name carried weight well beyond the numbers business, rather than to claim a specific close personal bond with any particular civil rights figure without stronger evidence. Returning to the central event of this story, the confrontation with the Italian Mafia's messenger in 1943, it's worth thinking about why this moment continues to resonate with people looking back on it today, in an era so different from the world Johnson operated in. Part of it is simply that stories of clever underdogs outmaneuvering powerful institutions are appealing on a basic human level, regardless of the legality or morality of what's actually being contested. But part of it is also that Johnson's approach offers a genuinely useful lesson that applies well beyond organized crime. He understood his opponent's actual motivation, rather than assuming it was simple hatred or simple greed for its own sake. He built an argument around that motivation, rather than emotional appeals, which his opponent had no reason to care about. He stayed calm enough to deliver that argument clearly, without the kind of visible fear or anger that would have undercut its credibility. And he had already built enough genuine standing and organization within his own community that his argument carried real weight, rather than being an empty bluff from someone with nothing behind it. None of this happened in isolation, and it's worth spending some time on the broader environment of Harlem's underworld during these years, because understanding that environment helps explain why Johnson was in a position to make this kind of argument in the first place. The numbers racket wasn't run by a single person anywhere in the neighborhood. It functioned through a network of bankers who financed and organized specific operations, runners who collected bets directly from customers on the street, and various people involved in tallying results, paying out winners, and managing the constant risk of police raids or theft. By the early 1940s, Johnson's position within this network had placed him at the center of enforcement and coordination, meaning that many people across Harlem had some connection to him, whether directly or through several layers of association. This gave him something the Italian families, for all their resources, did not have readily available in Harlem itself: genuine local knowledge and genuine local relationships built over years rather than imposed from outside. The Italian families, for their part, were not operating out of pure malice when they turned their attention toward Harlem. They were responding to the same economic pressures that any large organization seeking growth faces. Traditional bootlegging revenue had dried up after Prohibition ended in 1933. Other territories in the city were already divided among established families, with clear boundaries that had been fought over and settled, sometimes violently, years earlier. Harlem represented one of the last major unclaimed sources of gambling revenue within city limits, and from a purely financial standpoint, it made sense that someone downtown would eventually look at those numbers and decide the potential profit was worth the risk of moving in. What they may have underestimated, at least initially, was how differently Harlem would respond compared to other neighborhoods that had been absorbed into mob territory over the years. In many of those other cases, the local operators were smaller, less organized, or simply lacked the kind of community trust that Johnson had spent years building. Harlem was different, not because its operators were more violent or more ruthless, but because the relationship between the numbers business and the broader community was unusually close. People genuinely believed that keeping the business under local control meant keeping some of that money circulating within the neighborhood, funding things like rent for struggling families, support for local churches, and informal safety nets that the city itself failed to provide for black residents during this era. That belief, whether entirely accurate or not, gave Johnson a kind of legitimacy that made an outside takeover much more complicated than it would have been elsewhere. There's also the matter of law enforcement and politics, which played a much larger role in shaping outcomes during this period than most retellings acknowledge. New York City in the 1940s had a long, well-documented history of police corruption, with many officers and even higher-ranking officials receiving payments in exchange for looking the other way on various illegal enterprises. This corruption cut both ways. It meant that Johnson's operation, like many operations throughout the city regardless of who ran them, likely depended on some level of understanding with local police to function without constant disruption. It also meant that any large-scale attempt by the Italian families to seize control of Harlem's numbers business by force carried a genuine risk of drawing unwanted attention from federal authorities, who were already increasingly focused on organized crime as a national problem by the early 1940s, partly due to wartime concerns about corruption undermining public confidence during a national emergency. A messy, visible conflict in Harlem was the kind of thing that could invite the very scrutiny that men like Frank Costello worked very hard to avoid. This helps explain why Johnson's argument about cost and profit wasn't just clever rhetoric. It reflected a real, practical truth about the situation both sides were in. Violence wasn't free for the Italian families either, even setting aside any moral consideration entirely. Every act of force carried the risk of retaliation, the risk of police attention, the risk of federal investigation, and the risk of destabilizing a citywide criminal structure that had only recently been rebuilt into something resembling order after years of internal conflict during the 1930s. Johnson wasn't asking the mob to be generous. He was pointing out, accurately, that the math simply didn't favor a fight, and men who had built their entire careers around calculating exactly that kind of math were well positioned to hear that argument and take it seriously. It's worth sitting with the idea that this entire episode represents something different from the more commonly told stories of gangland conflict from this era, stories built around dramatic shootouts, betrayals, and violent enforcement. Those stories certainly happened throughout the history of organized crime in New York, and nobody should pretend that Johnson's world was free of violence entirely, because it clearly wasn't. But the specific moment at the center of this story stands out precisely because it didn't follow that pattern. It was resolved through argument, through a clear-eyed reading of incentives, and through Johnson's ability to present himself as someone the mob could work with profitably, rather than someone who needed to be eliminated at any cost. Some historians who study this period point out that this pattern, resolving territorial disputes through negotiated arrangements rather than open warfare, actually became more common as organized crime in America matured throughout the 20th century. The chaotic, deadly conflicts of the Prohibition era gradually gave way to more structured, business-like relationships among criminal organizations. partly because the men running these operations had learned, often through painful experience, that constant warfare was bad for business in almost every measurable way. Viewed through that lens, Johnson's approach to the 1943 ultimatum wasn't some singular act of individual genius disconnected from everything happening around it. It was, in some ways, ahead of a broader shift already reshaping how organized crime operated across the country, even as it drew on very specific local knowledge of Harlem that an outsider simply couldn't have. None of this diminishes what Johnson accomplished in that room. If anything, it helps explain why he succeeded where a less careful, less informed person likely would have failed. Understanding the broader currents of change happening within organized crime nationally, combined with an intimate, ground-level understanding of Harlem's specific economic and social reality, allowed him to construct an argument that worked on multiple levels at once. It worked practically, because it was true that violence would have been costly. It worked psychologically, because it denied the Italian families the emotional satisfaction of forcing a dramatic confrontation while still giving them a face-saving path to accepting the outcome. And it worked politically within Harlem itself, because word of what happened, however it eventually spread and however much it grew in the retelling over the years, reinforced Johnson's position as someone capable of protecting the neighborhood's interests without dragging it into a war that would have hurt everyone, including the very people the numbers business was supposedly helping. The years following this event were not simple or peaceful for Johnson, and it would be misleading to suggest that this one moment settled everything permanently. Organized crime relationships, even the more businesslike ones that developed over the following decades, remained fragile, subject to renegotiation whenever circumstances changed, whenever new leadership emerged within any of the involved families, or whenever external pressure from law enforcement forced adjustments. Johnson continued to face legal trouble throughout his life, being arrested multiple times on charges ranging from narcotics to other offenses connected to his ongoing involvement in illegal enterprises. His time at Alcatraz during the 1950s removed him from Harlem for years at a stretch, and while he returned afterward and remained a recognized figure until his death in 1968, the underworld he returned to had changed in various ways, shaped by shifting drug markets, changing law enforcement priorities, and a new generation of operators who hadn't lived through the earlier era of numbers running and territorial negotiation the way he had. Still, the 1943 confrontation remains a useful lens for understanding who Johnson was and how he approached the extraordinary pressure of operating as a black businessman, in the loosest sense of that word, within a criminal economy otherwise dominated by powerful white organizations with far greater resources and far more entrenched political connections. He didn't survive and thrive through raw violence alone, though he was certainly capable of defending his interests when necessary. He survived through a combination of local trust, careful reasoning, and an unusually clear understanding of what actually motivated the people he was dealing with. That combination is rare in any field, legal or illegal, and it's part of why this particular story continues to be told, retold, and studied by people interested in the history of Harlem, the history of organized crime in America, and the broader story of how black communities navigated systems that were rarely built with their survival in mind. It's also worth reflecting briefly on how much of this story depends on oral history and second-hand accounts, rather than clean, verifiable documentation, which is true of much of organized crime history, since the people involved had every reason to avoid leaving written records of their activities. Court records, newspaper coverage from the era, and later interviews with people who lived through this period all contribute to the picture, but they don't always agree perfectly on specific details, timelines, or the exact wording of conversations. Responsible retellings of this history acknowledge that uncertainty rather than presenting every detail as settled fact. What can be said with reasonable confidence is the broader outline described here, that pressure came from the Italian families in the early 1940s to bring Harlem's numbers business under tighter outside control, that Johnson resisted that pressure through negotiation and reasoning rather than through provoking open conflict, and that the outcome preserved a meaningful degree of local control over one of Harlem's most significant economic institutions during a period when almost nothing else in the neighborhood's economic life was under black control at all. Looking back at this story today, decades removed from the world it took place in, it's tempting to romanticize Johnson into a simple hero, standing alone against powerful outside forces on behalf of his community. That framing captures something true about the situation, but it also flattens a more complicated reality. Johnson was operating an illegal business that profited from the same hopes and struggles it claimed to serve, and the version of Harlem's independence he protected still existed within an economy that offered very few legitimate paths for black entrepreneurship at the time. Understanding this doesn't erase what was genuinely admirable about how he handled the Mafia's ultimatum. It simply asks us to hold both truths at once: that Johnson made a smart, disciplined decision under extraordinary pressure, and that the world that forced him into that position was itself deeply unjust, in ways that extended far beyond any single conversation with a mob messenger. That, in the end, is the real value of returning to this story now, not simply as an entertaining piece of underworld history, though it certainly is that, but as a case study in how someone without institutional power can still shape outcomes through preparation, patience, and a clear understanding of what actually drives the people across the table. Johnson didn't win that confrontation because he was more violent or more feared than the men he was negotiating with. He won it because he understood something they hadn't fully accounted for, that respecting the existing order in Harlem, rather than trying to erase it, served their own interests better in the long run. It's a lesson that has outlived the specific circumstances of 1943, and it's part of why this story, imperfectly remembered and partially reconstructed as it is, still gets told today. To really sit inside this story, it helps to slow down and picture Harlem as it actually looked and felt in 1943, rather than the flattened black and white version that shows up in most retellings. This was a neighborhood of roughly a few 100,000 people packed into a relatively small stretch of Upper Manhattan, most of them living in buildings that landlords, many of whom didn't even live in the neighborhood themselves, had let fall into disrepair. Rent in Harlem was often higher than in comparable white neighborhoods elsewhere in the city, even though wages for black workers were consistently lower, a contradiction that residents lived with every single day, and that historians now refer to as part of a broader pattern of housing discrimination that shaped black urban life across the country during this period. Against that backdrop, the numbers game wasn't just entertainment or an escape from boredom. For many families, it represented one of the only realistic paths, however unlikely on any given day, toward a sudden windfall that could cover a missed rent payment, a medical bill, or a debt hanging over a household for months. This is part of why the numbers business inspired such loyalty within the community, even though, viewed coldly, it was designed mathematically to take more money out of the neighborhood than it ever paid back in winnings. People understood the odds were against them. They played anyway, partly out of hope, and partly because the alternative, having no chance at all of a sudden windfall, felt even worse. Bankers and operators like Johnson understood this dynamic intimately, and whatever else can be said about the morality of running such an operation, it's worth acknowledging that Johnson and people like him were, in a very real sense, embedded in the daily emotional and financial rhythms of the neighborhood in a way that no outside organization, however wealthy or powerful, could easily replicate. This embeddedness is exactly what gave weight to Johnson's argument in his confrontation with the Mafia's messenger. He wasn't bluffing about community resistance to outside control. He had watched, over years, how quickly Harlem residents could make life difficult for anyone they didn't trust, whether through silence when police came asking questions, through quietly steering business away from unfamiliar operators, or through simply refusing to cooperate with anyone who didn't have earned standing in the neighborhood. It's also worth spending more time on Stephanie St. Clair, since her conflict with Dutch Schultz in the early 1930s set the template Johnson would later draw on, and her own story deserves more than a passing mention. St. Clair had arrived in New York from the Caribbean as a young woman with very little, and through sheer determination built one of the most successful numbers operations in Harlem during the 1920s, at a time when it was almost unheard of for a woman, let alone a black immigrant woman, to hold that kind of economic power in any American city. She was known for being fiercely protective of her independence, reportedly placing advertisements in local newspapers denouncing police corruption and demanding fair treatment for her community, a level of public defiance that was almost unimaginable for someone in her position at the time. When Dutch Schultz attempted to muscle into Harlem's numbers business in the early 1930s, St. Clair refused to simply hand over her operation, and according to widely repeated accounts from the period, she went so far as to provide information to law enforcement that contributed to pressure on Schultz's operations, even while continuing to run her own illegal business, a contradiction that speaks to just how complicated survival required people to be in this world. Schultz was eventually killed in 1935, not directly because of St. Clair's resistance alone, but as part of a broader falling out with other organized crime figures over his reckless plans to move against a prosecutor investigating him, plans that the wider mob leadership viewed as too dangerous and too likely to bring unwanted federal attention onto everyone. Johnson had worked closely with St. Clair through these years, gradually taking on more responsibility as her chief enforcer and eventually becoming the person she trusted to manage the practical, sometimes dangerous, day-to-day defense of their shared territory. By the time St. Clair's direct involvement in daily operations declined, Johnson had absorbed not just her business relationships, but her entire philosophy of resistance, the idea that Harlem's numbers business could survive outside pressure only if it refused to simply capitulate at the first sign of a threat, while also avoiding the kind of reckless conflict that had ultimately doomed men like Schultz. This is the inheritance Johnson carried into the room in 1943, and it's part of why his response to the ultimatum sounded less like improvisation and more like a lesson years in the making. There's another layer to this story that deserves attention: the specific historical moment the country found itself in during 1943, beyond just the local conditions in Harlem. The United States was fully engaged in the Second World War by this point, and the war effort touched nearly every aspect of American life, including, indirectly, organized crime. Wartime rationing created new black markets for goods such as gasoline, sugar, and other rationed items, and criminal organizations across the country adjusted their operations to capitalize on these opportunities. At the same time, the federal government's attention toward corruption and organized crime had sharpened considerably, partly out of concern that visible criminal activity or scandal could undermine public morale and confidence in institutions during a moment when national unity was considered essential to the war effort. This meant that any organized crime figure operating in New York during this period had to weigh not just local police and rival gangs, but the very real possibility of federal scrutiny that could follow from anything too visible or too disruptive. This national context helps explain why Frank Costello and the leadership around him were, by most accounts of the era, generally cautious about provoking unnecessary conflict, especially conflict that might draw outside attention to their broader operations across the city. Costello had, over the years, cultivated relationships with judges, politicians, and law enforcement officials that depended heavily on discretion and the appearance of order. A visible, drawn-out dispute in Harlem, especially one involving a black neighborhood already under close watch by city officials worried about unrest, was exactly the kind of situation that could unravel years of carefully built political protection. Johnson's argument about cost and profit wasn't just abstract economic theory in this context. It aligned precisely with the specific vulnerabilities that men like Costello were already worried about for entirely separate reasons. It's worth thinking, too, about what alternatives existed for the Italian families if they had chosen to ignore Johnson's argument and press forward with a takeover regardless. Historically, when outside organizations attempted forceful takeovers of established local operations, the results were often messier and more costly than anticipated, precisely because local operators with genuine community standing could draw on forms of resistance that were difficult to counter by pressure alone. Runners could simply stop reporting to new management. Customers could take their business further underground, to smaller, less visible operations that outside organizations would find harder to track and control. Corrupt police officials with long-standing relationships with local operators might quietly continue to protect those relationships even after a supposed change in ownership, undermining the new arrangement from within. All of this meant that even a successful takeover carried the risk of years of reduced profitability, while a new operation tried to rebuild the kind of trust and infrastructure that had taken Johnson and people like him decades to establish. Viewed this way, The argument Johnson made wasn't simply persuasive rhetoric. It reflected a genuine strategic reality that any careful outside observer would have had to acknowledge. None of this is to suggest that the relationship between Johnson's operation and the broader Italian-American crime networks in New York became simple or fully equal after this event. Power imbalances remained. The Italian families still held far greater resources, far more entrenched political connections across the city as a whole, and far more capacity to apply pressure through legal and financial channels that had nothing to do with direct confrontation. What changed in the aftermath of this event was the recognition that Harlem's numbers business, under Johnson's leadership, could not simply be absorbed the way other, less organized operations elsewhere in the city sometimes had been. Some form of ongoing coexistence, whatever its exact terms, became the practical reality, and that coexistence held, with periodic tension and renegotiation, for years afterward. It's useful here to talk a little about how this period of Johnson's life fits into the broader arc of his biography, since the 1943 confrontation was neither the beginning nor the end of his long, complicated career. By the time this ultimatum arrived, Johnson had already survived earlier stretches in prison, including time served on charges related to his involvement in the underworld economy of Harlem going back to the 1920s and 1930s. Incarceration was, in some ways, an occupational hazard for anyone operating at his level, and Johnson seems to have treated each stretch inside as something to be endured and outlasted, rather than something that would define or defeat him. This resilience mattered enormously for the events of 1943, because a man who had already weathered years of legal pressure and confinement was, by necessity, someone who had learned to think in terms of long-term survival rather than short-term displays of strength. That patience and long view are evident in how he handled the Mafia's ultimatum, choosing an approach centered on sustainable coexistence rather than a dramatic, short-term victory that might have felt satisfying in the moment but could have invited far greater retaliation over time. After the tension of 1943 eased into a more stable, if still uneasy, working arrangement, Johnson's standing within Harlem only grew. He became known not just as a numbers operator, but as someone the community could turn to in various informal ways, whether that meant quietly resolving disputes between neighborhood businesses, providing financial support to families going through hard times, or serving as an intermediary when tension arose between residents and city institutions that residents didn't trust to treat them fairly. This kind of informal community role wasn't unique to Johnson among successful underworld figures of the era, but the scale of his influence in Harlem specifically made him one of the more significant examples of this pattern in any American city during the mid-20th century. His later years brought new complications, however. In the 1950s, changing federal priorities around narcotics enforcement led to increased pressure on organized crime figures across the country, and Johnson was eventually convicted on narcotics-related charges, a conviction that some of his associates and biographers have described as questionable in terms of the underlying evidence, though it's worth being cautious about accepting that framing uncritically, since it comes largely from people sympathetic to Johnson rather than from neutral historical analysis. Regardless of the fairness of the specific conviction, Johnson was sent to serve time at Alcatraz, the federal prison on an island in San Francisco Bay, reserved during this period for prisoners considered especially high risk or especially difficult to manage in ordinary federal facilities. His time there removed him from Harlem for a significant stretch of years during the 1950s, a period during which the neighborhood itself was changing rapidly, shaped by new waves of migration, shifting drug markets that would eventually reshape organized crime in Harlem far more dramatically than anything the numbers racket had ever done, and continuing tension with city institutions over housing, policing, and economic opportunity. When Johnson eventually returned to Harlem after his release, those who knew him described someone who had changed in noticeable ways. Several accounts mention him reading scripture more than he had before, speaking more reflectively about his life choices, and generally carrying himself with a kind of weariness that suggested the years of incarceration had taken a real toll, both physically and emotionally. He continued to be a recognized figure in Harlem's social and economic life through the 1960s, though the criminal landscape around him had shifted considerably, with heroin trafficking becoming an increasingly dominant and increasingly destructive force in the neighborhood, displacing much of the older numbers economy that Johnson had spent his career defending and shaping. It's worth noting, with appropriate caution given the limits of available documentation, that Johnson's own relationship to the emerging heroin trade in Harlem during this period is a subject of some disagreement among people who have studied his life, with some accounts suggesting he tried to limit or resist its spread out of concern for its destructive impact on the community, and other accounts suggesting a more complicated relationship to that business as it grew. Given the limits of reliable documentation on this specific question, it's more honest to acknowledge the uncertainty than to assert a definitive answer. Johnson died in 1968, reportedly of a heart attack, in a restaurant in Harlem, a detail that many who tell his story find fitting, given how much of his life had been spent navigating the daily rhythms and relationships of that specific neighborhood. His funeral reportedly drew a large crowd, reflecting the depth of his standing within the community, even at the end of a life spent largely outside the boundaries of the law. In the decades since his death, Johnson's story has been revisited many times, in books, television portrayals, and retellings like this one that try to make sense of exactly what made him such a distinctive figure in the broader history of organized crime in America. Part of what continues to draw attention to this specific chapter of his life, the confrontation with the Italian Mafia's ultimatum in 1943, is that it captures something genuinely unusual within the broader history of organized crime disputes during this era. Most territorial disputes among criminal organizations during the 20th century, when they didn't end peacefully through negotiation, tended to end through a combination of pressure, betrayal, or one side simply overwhelming the other with superior resources. Johnson's approach charted a different course, relying on an argument grounded in economic reasoning and delivered with enough calm authority to reshape how a much larger, much better resourced organization chose to treat him. Whether every detail of how that argument was delivered has survived accurately through decades of retelling is impossible to verify with total certainty, but the underlying strategic logic is consistent with everything else known about how Johnson operated throughout his career, and that consistency is part of why this story continues to be taken seriously by people studying this period, rather than dismissed as pure legend. There's a broader lesson embedded in this history that extends well beyond the specific world of 1940s organized crime, and it has to do with how power actually shifts hands in negotiations between unequal parties. It's tempting to assume that the side with more resources, more connections, or more institutional backing will always dictate terms, and often that assumption holds true. But Johnson's example shows that even a significantly weaker party, in terms of raw resources, can shift outcomes by understanding precisely what the stronger party actually values, and by presenting a case that speaks directly to that value rather than appealing to abstract notions of fairness that the stronger party has no particular incentive to care about. This isn't a comfortable lesson in some ways, since it suggests that appeals to fairness alone rarely move parties who hold most of the leverage in a given situation. But it's a realistic one, and it's part of why this specific piece of Harlem's history continues to be studied and retold by people interested not just in the history of crime, but in the broader dynamics of negotiation, power, and survival under pressure. It's also worth reflecting on what this story tells us about the limits of official history and the value, despite its imperfections, of oral tradition and community memory in preserving stories that official records tend to overlook or distort. Much of what we know about Bumpy Johnson, Stephanie St. Clair, and the broader world of Harlem's numbers business during this period comes not from clean court records or contemporary newspaper coverage, which often either ignored Harlem's internal affairs entirely or covered them through a lens shaped by the racial biases common to mainstream journalism at the time, but from oral histories, later interviews, and the accumulated memory of a community that understood its own history mattered even when the broader society around it showed little interest in recording it accurately. This means that any retelling of this story, including this one, is working with imperfect and sometimes contradictory source material, and it's important to hold that uncertainty honestly, rather than presenting every detail as settled historical fact. What remains clear, across the range of available accounts, is the broader shape of what happened, the pressure Harlem's numbers business faced from outside organized crime in the early 1940s, the specific way Johnson chose to respond to that pressure, and the lasting impact that response had on how Harlem's underworld operated for years afterward. Understanding this story properly means resisting the urge to simplify it into either a pure hero narrative or a pure cautionary tale about criminal enterprise. It was both and neither at the same time. Johnson made a genuinely impressive strategic decision under real pressure, one that protected something the community around him valued, even as that something was itself an illegal business built on odds stacked against the very people playing it. He navigated a moment of extraordinary danger without resorting to open conflict that could have destroyed everything he'd built, while also remaining, throughout his life, someone who profited from an economy of hope that took more from his neighbors than it ever gave back in winnings. Both of these truths belong in any honest account of who he was and what he accomplished in that room in 1943, facing down an ultimatum that could have ended very differently, and choosing instead to answer it with an argument rooted in patience, understanding, and a clear-eyed reading of exactly what the men across from him actually valued most. It's worth taking a moment, before closing this out, to think about why a story like this still finds an audience so many decades after it happened, in a world that looks almost nothing like the Harlem of 1943. Part of the answer is simply that people are drawn to stories about outmatched underdogs who win through intelligence rather than force, a pattern that shows up across cultures and across centuries because it speaks to something people want to believe is true, that cleverness and patience can sometimes overcome raw power. But there's a more specific reason this particular story resonates with modern audiences, and it has to do with how closely it mirrors situations people face today in far less dramatic settings, whether that's a small business owner negotiating with a much larger competitor, threatening to undercut them, an employee pushing back against unfair treatment from a much more powerful employer, or simply anyone trying to protect something they've built against outside pressure from people who assume they can simply take it. Johnson's approach in that room offers a template that applies well beyond organized crime, which is part of why people keep returning to this story even outside the context of true crime history. The core of that template is worth spelling out plainly, since it's easy to admire the story without fully absorbing the lesson inside it. Johnson didn't win by matching the mob's capacity for pressure with pressure of his own, because he simply didn't have the resources to win that kind of contest outright. What he did instead was identify the actual decision-making criteria the other side was using, which in this case were profit and risk, not honor or pride, and he built his entire argument around that criterion, rather than around what he personally felt was fair or right. This required him to set aside any instinct toward pride or defiance for its own sake, and instead approach the conversation almost like a negotiator studying the other party's interests before ever walking into the room. That kind of discipline is rare, especially under the kind of pressure Johnson was facing, where a wrong word or a visible flash of anger could have changed the outcome entirely. It's also worth noting how much restraint this required, not just in the moment of the conversation itself, but in the years leading up to it. Johnson had, by all accounts, built a reputation over nearly 2 decades in Harlem's underworld as someone who used force only when necessary and effective, never as a first resort, and never as a way of proving a point for its own sake. This reputation is exactly what allowed his calm response to the ultimatum to be taken seriously, rather than dismissed as empty words from someone with nothing behind them. If Johnson had been known as reckless or unpredictable, the same argument delivered with the same calm tone might have been read as a bluff, or worse, as weakness disguised as reason, because his reputation already established that he was capable of defending his interests decisively when required. His choice to respond with reasoning instead of force carried weight precisely because it was clearly a choice, not a default born of fear. This distinction matters a great deal, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. There's a meaningful difference between someone who avoids conflict because they're afraid of losing it, and someone who avoids conflict because they've calculated, correctly, that avoiding it serves their interests better, even though they could likely hold their own if forced into it. The men receiving Johnson's message in 1943 understood this difference because they were, after all, men who spent their entire professional lives assessing exactly this kind of question about the people they dealt with. Reading Johnson's calm response as genuine strategic confidence rather than fear required them to already have a baseline respect for his capabilities, built over years of watching how he ran his operation and handled previous disputes. Without that foundation, the argument alone likely wouldn't have carried the same weight. There's also something worth saying about the emotional discipline this moment required from everyone involved, not just Johnson. The messenger delivering the ultimatum had to report back accurately, without either exaggerating Johnson's defiance in a way that might provoke unnecessary escalation, or downplaying it in a way that might get him blamed later for mishandling the message. Frank Costello and the leadership around him had to receive that report and evaluate it, without letting wounded pride override the practical calculation Johnson had laid out. Every person involved in this chain of communication had to prioritize a clear-eyed reading of the situation over the more immediate emotional pull to assert dominance or save face through a show of force. That collective restraint across multiple parties with very different incentives is part of what made a peaceful outcome possible, and it's a reminder that even in a world defined by violence and intimidation, the men running these organizations were still capable of behaving like careful, calculating business people when the situation called for it. Looking at this event from a wider historical distance also invites a comparison to how other minority communities across American history have had to navigate pressure from more powerful outside institutions, whether those institutions were criminal organizations, corporations, or government bodies. Time and again, the communities that fared best weren't necessarily the ones with the most raw resources to fight back, but the ones that understood how to make their continued existence and cooperation more valuable to the more powerful party than their elimination or absorption would be. This isn't a universal solution, and it doesn't always work, since sometimes the more powerful party simply doesn't care about long-term costs and acts out of pure dominance regardless of the economics involved. But when it does work, as it did in this specific instance in Harlem in 1943, it offers a rare example of how understanding an opponent's actual incentives, rather than simply resisting on principle, can produce outcomes that pure defiance alone might never have achieved. It's worth closing this account by returning to the image that opened it. A calm man sitting across from a messenger sent to deliver an ultimatum backed by the full weight of New York's most powerful criminal organization. There was no dramatic display of force in that room, no raised voices, no visible fear. What there was, instead, was a carefully built argument, years in the making, delivered by someone who understood exactly what was at stake and exactly what would move the people on the other side of the table. That combination of preparation, restraint, and precise understanding of another party's motivations is rare in any context, legal or illegal. And it's exactly why this moment from Harlem's history continues to be worth telling, even now, so many decades after it happened, in a world that has changed almost completely from the one Bumpy Johnson knew. If you want to understand how this uneasy arrangement between Johnson and the Italian families held together over the following years, and what eventually tested it again, that part of the story deserves its own telling, and it's worth staying subscribed for when it comes.